You can't count on the French, but you can always count on the French to be French. And when they got assigned to train a Ukrainian brigade, well, it seems like they may have dropped the ball. But are the Ukrainians themselves just as responsible as anyone? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is a story that is interesting and maybe a little sad, because a French-trained Ukrainian brigade is facing a probe following what they call mismanagement and desertion allegations. Ukrainian authorities launched an investigation into the Anna of Kiev brigade following reports of inadequate personnel screening, equipment shortages, and desertions. Now, this is a brigade that was supposed to be a top-tier brigade, 2,000 troops trained in France and equipped with top-tier French gear, including Kaiser howitzers and a French tank. But the problem is, as in September to November, so the brigade was originally going to have about 2,000 troops that the French were training. And one thing that I want to point out is that the French themselves weren't really sure what they were training them on. And this is something I've talked about ad nauseum on this channel. A Ukrainian brigade, according to the French, their defense ministry said, "We trained and equipped a brigade of 2,000 personnel for combined arms operations in the second half of 2024. They said the training occurred using French equipment intended for transfer to Ukraine, with soldiers returning home with their equipment afterward." And I point this out because combined arms operations is not what the current battlefield is. While there is a combined arms aspect to it, if you go into a NATO headquarters and you say we're preparing for combined arms operations, what that implies is that there's an expectation that those arms include artillery, tanks, close air support in a very active combat way. And the truth is that in the current environment, it just doesn't look like that, right? Artillery operates with much more independence. The only thing that really conducts what you would call combined arms operations is maybe drones, is maybe the drone support. And this is sort of where things I think, go sideways. The brigade originally had 2,000 service members. Now, they said only 51 of those soldiers had served more than a year, and about 500 had served less than a year, and then 1,400 were brand new recruits with less than 2 months of service. Now, I want to point out that this ratio is actually not terrible, but what I suspect happened in the case of these who served more than 2 months but less than a year is that essentially units on the front were told, hey, you have to cough up some soldiers for this brigade. And what I strongly suspect happened is that those brigades that coughed up soldiers said, yeah, we'll send you our guys who have they said they just have to have combat experience. And so what I think those commanders probably did is they looked at their formations and they said, listen, I can't afford to lose my best drone pilot. I can't afford to lose this guy who's been doing infantry ops for 6 months straight. I can't afford to lose this guy who can fix every weapon that we have in the battlefield. So who do I send? Well, I'm going to send the brand new guy or the fuck up. Right? That's who those commanders are going to cough up. It's not a secret. Every military does it. We did it. When they told us, hey, give me a soldier for tasking, unless I liked the unit and and unless there was a persistent relationship with them where I didn't want them to have to deal with my dirtbags, I would absolutely send them my worst soldiers because I needed my good soldiers, right? So you can't fault these commanders for saying we don't want to. We're already shorthanded. We can't afford to. We can only give you our absolute worst performer or our gooberiest newest guy. And so what you had is very little combat experience and a lot of brand new, fresh out of the street recruits. Right? They said about 150 of them were sent to training without even completing their basic combat prep course. And so this is pretty scary because the basic prep course itself is like 45 days of service. So the fact that 1,400 of them were literally just pulled off the street, sent to basic combat course, then sent to be trained up as a brigade in France is itself pretty troubling, right? Now, the allegations, the problem is that, right, between September and November, the brigade got 4,000 additional recruits, bringing their number up to 6,000. And while the initial combat operations of the brigade, they said about 200 cases of AWOL were recorded, the actual number of AWOL seems like it might be way higher. And we're going to break that down, plus what the brigade was supposed to be used for, and more importantly, where these recruits should have gone instead. But I wanted to mention, first off, if you haven't hit the subscribe button, you should. But more importantly, if you want to support the channel and get access to uncensored combat videos, that is on combatvetnews.com. Right? Any one of the membership tiers gets you access to the twice-a-week uncensored combat videos, plus the archive of dozens and dozens and dozens of combat footage stretching back to the start of the war. We just took a look at the viral knife fight video. It was probably the most intense video I have ever recorded. And so if you want that, can check it out on Combat Vet News. And you can support me becoming a member. The link is in the description. Okay. So here's what I want to point out. Is that here was the thinking about this brigade as of December 27th, right? They were like, it's a new mechanized brigade, Leopard 2s. It's going to reinforce Pokrovsk right in the nick of time. And there was hope that as the Russians bear down on Pokrovsk, the 155th would deploy with the German Leopard 2s and French-made Kaiser howitzers. French brigade had been training in France and Poland until recently, but there was really thought that, remember, the whole front was headed up by a Donetsk operational tactical group, right, which contained about 5 brigades worth of soldiers. And so getting a 6th would represent, something like a 20% increase in their manpower. They said it would have 155th with 2,000 fresh soldiers. But then apparently it had already disintegrated like before it ever made it to the front. And the brigade was supposed to have 6,000 troops. And then 1,700 of those went AWOL at some point during the 9-month train up. And as recently in November, up to 500 soldiers were still reported AWOL. Now, they say this is an organizational and leadership failure. And there's been a priority among Ukrainians to have new novice brigades over replenishing existing veteran brigades that might be down to as little as half of their original strength. And what they point out, first off, I want to recognize that AWOL could be a lot of things. And again, if 2/3 of them returned to the brigade, it says that in all likelihood, they weren't trying to vanish. They more likely were probably on base, on a French base. They said, listen, you guys want to go out to the nearby town and have a drink? And they said, yeah, okay, let's go. And then they got hit with AWOL. Some of them may have actually tried to flee and desert. It's hard to know. But still, when you're looking at up to 1 in 3 of those troops going AWOL at some point, it really speaks to a lack of discipline and a lack of focus. And so I find it interesting that the priority is now forming new brigades. But I think the problem is, of course, a lot of the brigades are dysfunctional because imagine you're a brigade commander and you get told, hey, cough up some of your officers to lead this new brigade. And that brigade commander is going to go, well, here's what I'm not going to give you. I'm not going to give you my most experienced commander. I'm not going to give you my superstars who just got promoted. I'm not going to give you my guys who know everybody in the brigade and know everybody by the top end. So I'm going to send you my dirtbag officer, the guy who I've been trying to get rid of the entire time. And when you form a new brigade, that's who you get in these personnel constrained environments. And this is sort of just the fundamental tough part is there's just not enough good soldiers to go around. And when you ask commanders to cough up soldiers when they're already shorthanded, they're going to give you their worst. And so the problem is then those brigades go into combat and they just underperform pretty badly. You also have this thing where an existing brigade in combat is going to know a bunch of shit that new brigades don't. Right? They're going to know about their front lines. They're going to know the subtleties. They're going to go, well, the Russians here do things a little different, right? When I was in Touretsk, it was interesting because talking to the Liu Brigade guys, they're like, listen, Touretsk is its own animal. The Russians just are different here. There's more optical drones. The combat is much more urban. They really were like, each section of the front line is its own unique animal because the Russians opposite us are unique animals, and we choose to fight them in a unique way. They talked about how they structured their forces to create kill zones inside the city to bait the Russians in, right? But it was a very specific tactic against a very specific Russian force. And so when you bring in a fresh new brigade, you're going to have a spike in casualties as that brigade tries to orient itself to the battlefield. And this is a spike that the Ukrainian military likely believes they can't afford. But they have really only bad trade-offs, because the trade-off is to reinforce the existing brigades. And that's something that a lot of people said Ukraine should have been doing, is taking these fresh recruits, putting them into experienced brigades. The problem is that a lot of them aren't willing or able to train up fresh troops. And it means that those experienced troops remain in continuous combat. And so what Ukraine said is, listen, every time we stand up a new brigade, we get to rotate out one of these veteran brigades. And then the thinking is, when those brigades are rotated out, then they will get plussed up with new recruits. And so while they have a 60-day lull in the fighting, then they can say, listen, we've got a little time. Let's train these fresh recruits in how we do drones, how we do attacks, how we do reconnaissance, how we work things. And then when everybody has gelled as a unit because the pressure's been off, then we go back into combat ready to fight with our numbers fully plussed up. That is kind of the preferred thinking. And that's probably what the Ukrainians were planning. That was the trade-off they were willing to do. Again, the catch is that when you form whole new brigades, again, you have this pretty bad leadership. And it just reflects the trade-offs that Ukrainians have to make. Now, what I want to point out, though, is that while there's always a lot of, like, you know, news, I don't want to call it bad news, but it is bad news, right? It's steady Russian advances. What I want to point out is that those Russian advances aren't really all that critical. People say, oh, Pokrovsk, it's in such grave danger. And it is, but this has been weeks and weeks and weeks. The Russians have been trying to make this encirclement over Pokrovsk, and it's simply just glacially slow. Yeah, they're seizing tiny little towns, advancing in these like creeping ways. And people said it's been so long that the Russians, people have said Pokrovsk is done for, right? Pokrovsk doesn't have a chance. And the truth is that, remember, the Russians were 10 kilometers from Pokrovsk something like 6 months ago. They are now currently 6.2 kilometers from Pokrovsk. So you're talking about just a really, really small margin for these guys and for of advance that the Russians are making. And so while no one is out here claiming that the fighting is not hard. It is intensive, but the Russians are definitely not achieving their objectives, right? And I point this out because, again, you look at the core of Ukraine's territory in Kursk, where the North Koreans are fighting. You can see that the Russian progress has been just glacially slow. I mean, this is like, you could see them just sort of attriting out. This is as of December 1st. You could see that the Russians have advanced literally 5s of kilometers is what they've seized in Kursk. And then you have, more total area, but no operationally significant places. You could see them seizing, again, pretty low value terrain, and that's not by accident. And so, again, we sit there and go, oh, these brigades are having a lot of problems. They're having personnel problems. They're making tough trade-offs. But ultimately, I think the Ukrainian strategy should get credit where credit's due, and their ability to hold off the Russians continuously does appear to be succeeding. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Huge thank you to the Colonel tier members like Martin Baum, Chris Rossi, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, Sergei Zinchenko, Chris Holmes, Chris Gorsuch, Daniel M., Ida Skycall, all of our Lieutenant tier members. Hope you guys enjoyed that extremely crazy knife fight video. That was pretty intense. I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.